if you look at the Articles of Confederation, you practically have to have a microscope and a pair of tweezers to find a president there. It's mentioned, but the president under the Articles was a presiding office, there to preside over the Congress, which was the be-all and end-all of the government under the Articles of Confederation. If you look at that document, frequent references to the United States and Congress assembled over and over again. The United States and Congress assembled gives powers to do this, gives powers to do that. Any of the national powers that existed in the national government and under the Articles was in a Congress. There was practically no president there.
The Articles of Confederation was a pushback from that centralized power. What the goal was to decentralize power to the colonies, not to have a strong, robust central government, but rather focus on self-government, focus on the ability of individuals and states to govern themselves, to make the decisions that they thought were useful for themselves, their particular environment, whether it was geographic or economic. But the goal was essentially to depose the central power. And in that sense, it came with a very weak central government and powers from that.
Why was this the case? Well, because they'd had a very bad experience with executive power under British rule. Most people don't stop to think that there had been something on the order of a century or more of colonial governing experience before we become a nation, right? Jamestown is 1607, I believe. And so in Virginia, you've got something on the order of a century and a half of governing experience among people who are residing here and dealing with the powers that be in England. And that experience had not gone very well for the colonials with respect to executive power. You'd had a king that was remote and looking after interest in England. It was a mercantile system so that the colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country. You had economic activity here which was set up to benefit the mother country. And so the interests of the crown were very different than the people who resided here. And importantly, the king had agents here to look after his interests in the form of what? A colonial governor, right? And so the experience of the American colonials at that time was that colonial governors, the executive power, was not exactly a foreign presence because they were all subjects of the crown, but they were alien in the sense that their primary interests were to serve the king and to make sure that the interests of the mother country were preserved, not so much the interest of the colonials themselves. The native way of governing here on this side of the Atlantic was government by assembly. There were assemblies developed that were sort of democratically elected. I mean, it was property-based, but it was popularly elected here. And so if you ask yourself, what was the experience of the American colonies for that 100 years, 130 years, 150 years before we become a nation, it is an experience of governing by assembly, with the governors themselves being a representative of the crown and often engaged in very heavy-handed governance in ways that the colonials didn't particularly appreciate. So the evidence of the Articles of Confederation is that experience had taught Americans that executive power was suspect, that it was a sort of alien kind of power, and the legislature was the place where their wishes were best represented. So that's the first major piece of evidence in this sort of pre-constitutional era about not just this ambivalence, but at that time a kind of antipathy towards executive power.
The colonial experience with the executive was a difficult one. The executive for the colonies was the king, the monarch in England, who had absolute control over policy, over tax collection, and really over the lives of colonial inhabitants of what is now the United States. and it was a central point of contention for many colonists, and it was a central point of contention from across the Atlantic. And it led to really the uprising that became the American Revolution. But the concept and the legitimacy of executive power and the policies that came about from it was really the spark that set things off.
Second piece of evidence from the series is in the Declaration of Independence, right? Most of us, there are thousands and thousands of 4th of July celebrations, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble is read, when in the course of human events and so forth. You get this, this very poetic preamble. Most people stop at that. And yet, if you look at the body of the Declaration of Independence, it's an indictment of the exercise of political power as it had existed to that time. But it's not just any indictment, it's an indictment of the King of England, which is actually sort of strange if you think about the experience of the colonials, because all these things we learn about as grade school students, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the provision of a monopoly on tea to the East India Company. All of these things were acts of Parliament, right? And so you would think the Declaration of Independence would be an indictment of parliamentary power, and it wasn't. I have a copy of the Declaration here, and it's just over and over an indictment not of Parliament, but of the King. He, every clause begins with he did this, he did that. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of the legislatures. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. He has excited domestic insurrections. He has abdicated the government here. He has done this over and over again. And yet, as we know from careful study, it was a Parliament that had done most of this. Most historians agree that George III really didn't have much to do with many of the things that had aggravated the colonials. Why is the Declaration of Independence framed this way? It goes back to this antipathy towards executive power. The Declaration is in the best sense of the term, a public relations document. It was there to convince the American people and a broader world of the righteousness of their cause. And the best way that they knew how to do that, because they understood this antipathy towards executive power, was to place all the blame not on the assembly overseas, but to place all the blame on the king himself. So by the time you come to the formation of the American Constitution, you've had this vast experience of a colonial America in which their experience with executives had not been very good. They formed a government of their preferences that did not have an executive, and it was only after they had become convinced as a result of their experience as an independent country without an executive that they began to rethink their logic and turn to a different form of government that we find in the Constitution, which has, as a featured centerpiece, an independent presidency.